By early 1944, the Eastern Front had entered a critical strategic phase. After the Soviet victory at Stalingrad in February and subsequent advances in Ukraine, the Wehrmacht's northern flank, Army Group Center, faced increasing isolation. The front line in Belarus had stabilized in depth, with German forces holding a salient anchored on cities such as Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Minsk. This salient was bounded by river systems like the Berezina and Dnieper, which formed natural defensive boundaries. Yet these were assisted only by hastily prepared fortifications and strip defenses, not continuous operational lines. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Ernst Busch comprised approximately 850,000 personnel, organized into 4 armies: 3rd Panzer Army in the north, 4th Army in the center, 9th Army in the south, with bits of the 2nd Army managing the extreme western flank. Many divisions operated significantly below strength. Field reports indicated infantry units averaged 6,000 to 8,000 men each, in contrast to an establishment strength exceeding 15,000. Armored reserves were thin, scattered, and often held in depth. German intelligence, while alert, underestimated the scale of the upcoming Soviet plan, misreading signals and accepting Soviet deception tactics, particularly those indicating a main offensive heading into Ukraine. On the Soviet side, planning for Operation Bagration emerged between late 1943 and early 1944. Stavka identified Belarus as a vital strategic axis for removing Army Group Center from the field, opening routes into Poland, and liberating Soviet territory. The order of battle called for 4 fronts to engage in a coordinated offensive: the 1st Baltic Front, General Bagramyan; 3rd and 2nd Belarusian Fronts, Generals Chernyakhovsky and Zakharov; and the 1st Belarusian Front, Marshal Rokossovsky. Combined forces totaled over 2.3 million personnel, supported by more than 5,200 armored vehicles, tanks, and self-propelled guns, over 30,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and roughly 5,300 combat aircraft, forming a force several times larger than the German defenders in the salient. Geopolitically, the liberation of Belarus held deep significance. For Joseph Stalin and the Soviet leadership, it offered both material and propaganda value. Restoring a Soviet republic and reclaiming territory would strengthen internal and Allied morale and position the Red Army rapidly to move into Poland and East Prussia. Allied tensions, especially at Tehran, scheduled for November 1943, underscored the importance of demonstrating Soviet strategic capability. In contrast, the Germans depended on Belarus as a defensive buffer to protect the heartlands of the Reich and to hold open critical lines of communication between army groups north and south. From mid-1943, Soviet partisans in Belarus had intensified their guerrilla campaign, targeting rail lines, bridges, and communication nodes. Known collectively as the Rail War, these actions disrupted German reinforcements and supply routes, hampering the Wehrmacht's ability to maneuver or reinforce its front. The effectiveness of this irregular warfare was reinforced by extensive Soviet maskirovka, camouflage, and deception, designed to mislead German intelligence regarding the timing, scale, and direction of the Soviet main effort. Vehicles, radio transmissions, and supply depots were staged in false areas. Dummy formations appeared to suggest intent south of Belarus. Public sentiment under German occupation was marked by hardship. Decades of authoritarian Soviet rule had bred suspicion of some sectors, yet German occupation was harsh. Reprisals, forced labor, and deportations created deep resentment. Rural territories increasingly came under partisan influence. German administrative control was increasingly tenuous. All of these factors were understood by Soviet planners and played into the strategic calculus. Rapid offensive operations backed by local assistance could disrupt German cohesion. By June 1944, both belligerents had positioned their strengths for an operational showdown. For the Germans, a heavily extended defensive line, depleted divisions, and weak reserves. For the Soviets, a massive, coordinated multi-front force, mastery of deception, and partisan support. The preparatory stage was complete. The front was set for a major Soviet winter-to-spring offensive that would aim not merely to push the Wehrmacht westward, but to destroy one of its principal army groups in the field. The opening phase of Operation Saturn began in mid-December 1942, as the Soviet High Command moved to exploit the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Initially conceived as Little Saturn, due to limitations in forces and supply, the operation targeted Axis positions along the Middle Don River, aiming to destroy the Italian Eighth Army and cut the main supply routes to German forces further south. This phase involved the Voronezh Front under General Golikov and the Southwestern Front under General Vatutin, coordinating with the Stalingrad Front to maintain pressure on German relief efforts. On 16 December, after several days of artillery preparation and reconnaissance in force, Soviet units attacked along a broad front from the Don north of the Chir River down to the Bogachar sector. The main strike force, comprising the 1st Guards Army, 3rd Guards Army, and 6th Army, deployed over 400 tanks, supported by thousands of guns and mortars. The target was the positions of the Italian 8th Army, which held a 270-kilometer sector with divisions averaging only 7,000 to 8,000 men and limited anti-tank capability. These defenses were quickly penetrated in several areas, with Soviet spearheads advancing up to 25 kilometers on the first day. Axis command structures reacted unevenly. General Garibaldi, commanding the Italian 8th Army, had requested reinforcements earlier, but German reserves were tied up in Operation Wintergewitter, the relief attempt for Stalingrad. Luftwaffe air support was minimal due to poor weather, and retreat orders were delayed by both German and Italian higher commands in an effort to hold ground. This allowed Soviet mechanized corps, particularly the 24th and 25th Tank Corps, to exploit the breaches, overrunning artillery positions and cutting off retreating units. In the following days, Soviet forces advanced toward key river crossings over the Donets and along the communications axis leading to Milarovo. The rapid Soviet gains threatened not only the destruction of Italian formations, but also the collapse of the Hungarian Second Army and German units positioned on their flanks. German attempts to form blocking positions with ad hoc Kampfgruppen met with limited success due to insufficient manpower and equipment. By 20th of December, entire Italian divisions had ceased to function as organized units. The Soviet advance had created a widening gap between Army Groups B and Don, endangering the rear of German forces operating in the Caucasus. Recognizing the threat, the German High Command began preparations for a general withdrawal from the exposed salient, but these measures lagged behind the speed of the Soviet push. The opening phase had achieved its immediate objective, rupturing Axis lines along the Don, and setting conditions for a deeper thrust toward the rear of Army Group A in the south. The strategic goals for Operation Saturn were shaped by the events unfolding around Stalingrad and along the broader southern sector of the Eastern Front in late 1942. The original Soviet plan, approved by the Stavka in November, envisioned a deep encirclement operation. After destroying the Italian 8th Army on the Don, Soviet mobile forces would drive south and southwest, severing the main German lines of communication through Rostov-on-Don. This maneuver aimed to trap not only the German 6th Army in Stalingrad, but also Army Group A, then operating in the Caucasus. Such an outcome would have potentially eliminated over 20 divisions, in addition to those already encircled in Stalingrad. Operational realities and logistical constraints forced a revision. The Germans had assembled a relief force, Operation Wintergewitter, under General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, which, if successful, could stabilize the situation in Stalingrad. Furthermore, the Soviet forces allocated to the deep strike lacked the full complement of tank armies and long-range logistical support needed for such an extended advance in harsh winter conditions. As a result, Stavka approved a scaled-down version, Little Saturn, directed primarily at the destruction of Axis forces along the Middle Don and the creation of a dangerous threat to German rear areas without overextending Soviet spearheads. The primary striking force consisted of the 1st Guards Army under General Kuznetsov, the 3rd Guards Army under General Lelyushenko, and the 6th Army under General Chistyakov. These formations were supported by the 17th Air Army, tasked with interdiction of enemy movements and close air support for ground operations. Soviet planners emphasized coordinated blows against weak points in the Italian 8th Army's sector, where defenses relied heavily on static positions, had few mobile reserves, and contained inadequate anti-tank weaponry. German intelligence partially detected Soviet preparations, but misjudged the scale and direction. The Wehrmacht believed the Soviets might launch local offensives to support their Stalingrad encirclement, but expected the main winter effort in the central or northern sectors. Consequently, German reserves in the south were insufficient and poorly positioned to counter a broad front breakthrough. Axis Allied forces, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian, were ordered to hold their positions, despite commanders' requests to shorten lines and concentrate forces. Logistical planning on the Soviet side sought to pre-position fuel, ammunition, and engineering supplies as far forward as possible without alerting German aerial reconnaissance. Railways recently repaired after the summer fighting were heavily used to bring in additional armor, with tank brigades reinforced by T-34s and KV-1s, as well as lighter T-70s for reconnaissance and exploitation roles. Artillery assets included hundreds of 76mm divisional guns, 122mm howitzers, and Katyusha multiple rocket launchers to provide massed fire during the initial assault. Propaganda on both sides also played a role. Soviet messaging portrayed the offensive as a decisive blow to liberate occupied territory and avenge earlier defeats on the Don. German propaganda minimized the threat, emphasizing the steadfastness of the Axis coalition, though privately the German High Command recognized the vulnerability of their allies' sectors. These mismatched assessments set the stage for the Soviet offensive to achieve a strategic shock far greater than what the Germans anticipated. The first engagements of Operation Saturn unfolded rapidly after the opening artillery barrages on 16 December 1942. Soviet assault units, heavily concentrated on the flanks of the Italian 8th Army, struck in multiple sectors simultaneously, with the intention of overwhelming the defenders before they could organize a coherent response. The Italian 2nd Infantry Division Sforzesca and 9th Infantry Division Pasubio, positioned near the main axes of advance, bore the brunt of the attack. Lacking adequate numbers of anti-tank weapons, most battalions fielded only a handful of 47mm guns and some outdated 75mm pieces. Their lines were penetrated by T-34s within hours. The 1st Guards Army's infantry regiments, supported by attached tank brigades, pushed forward at an average rate of 10 to 15 kilometers per day, bypassing strong points where possible and isolating them for follow-up forces. By the second day, the Soviet spearheads had created gaps of 20-30 kilometers in the Italian sector. Attempts to plug these gaps with German reserve units, such as elements of the 27th Panzer Division and Kampfgruppe Fretter Pico, met with heavy resistance and were slowed by snow-covered roads and fuel shortages. Civilians in the occupied villages along the Don experienced immediate upheaval. The retreating Axis forces requisitioned transport, food, and winter clothing, while Soviet units advancing through the same areas requisitioned similar resources for their own needs. In several cases, partisan groups emerged from hiding to guide Soviet columns through back roads, avoiding mined highways and accelerating the encirclement of isolated enemy formations. By 18th of December, the Soviet 24th Tank Corps had swung deep into the Italian rear, capturing Bogachar, a key logistical hub. This severed one of the principal supply routes for Axis units defending the Don Bend. Italian formations caught east of the penetration found themselves surrounded or forced into chaotic retreats across the frozen steppes under constant artillery harassment. German liaison officers reported that in some cases, entire regiments dissolved as soldiers attempted to march west in small groups without heavy weapons or organized command. The psychological effect on the Axis coalition was immediate. Hungarian Second Army units to the north began pulling back in response to the exposed flank, while Romanian elements further south requested permission to shorten their lines. The German High Command, still committed to Operation Wintergewitter, hesitated to authorize a full-scale withdrawal from the Don, fearing it would compromise the relief of Stalingrad. This hesitation allowed Soviet forces to deepen their penetration and widen the breach to over 100 kilometers in some sectors. Unexpectedly for the Soviets, resistance in certain pockets was more stubborn than anticipated. The German 385th Infantry Division and elements of the 3rd Mountain Division, deployed in reserve for the Italians, established defensive lines on key river crossings, delaying Soviet progress for up to 48 hours. These holding actions, though costly, bought time for some Axis units to retreat in better order. Nevertheless, by 20th December, the first phase of contact battles had transitioned into a general collapse of the Italian front, setting the stage for a broader encirclement and the capture of strategic positions along the Middle Don. As the Soviet offensive gained momentum after the breakthroughs of 16-20 December 1942, the situation for the Axis coalition along the Don escalated into a full-scale crisis. The Italian Eighth Army had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, with multiple corps-level commands losing contact with subordinate units. German liaison officers reported that some divisions could account for less than 2,000 men in organized formations, compared to the 12,000, 15,000 nominal strength. Entire artillery regiments were abandoned in place due to a lack of draft animals, fuel, or functioning motor transport. Soviet operational exploitation was swift. The 3rd Guards Army advanced toward Kantemirovka, while the 1st Guards Army pressed west toward Milarovo, aiming to envelop remaining Axis units along the Donets. Tank and mechanized corps operated deep in the rear areas, destroying depots, seizing rail junctions, and interdicting retreat routes. The speed of these maneuvers created logistical challenges even for the Red Army. Supply convoys often lagged behind armored spearheads, forcing tank crews to ration fuel and ammunition until forward depots could be re-established. The Germans attempted to stabilize the front by committing reserves from Army Group B and transferring elements from Army Group A's northern flank. Units such as the 11th Panzer Division and 6th Panzer Division were redeployed under winter conditions, often arriving piecemeal and without the benefit of full maintenance. Their mission was not to counterattack decisively, but to form blocking lines to buy time for the withdrawal of forces from exposed positions. These formations engaged in rearguard actions, inflicting temporary delays on Soviet mechanized units, but were insufficient to reverse the overall operational tide. Weather compounded the crisis. Temperatures along the Middle Don fell below 20 degrees, with heavy snowstorms reducing visibility and hindering movement on open ground. For retreating Axis troops, this meant forced marches under extreme cold without adequate winter gear, particularly among the Italian and Hungarian survivors, many of whom had been issued lighter uniforms intended for summer campaigning. Frostbite casualties mounted, adding to the already severe losses from combat and artillery fire. The Soviet High Command recognized that the Axis collapse along the Don created an opportunity to expand objectives beyond the original Little Saturn plan. Discussions began on whether to push directly toward Rostov-on-Don, which, if taken, could trap the bulk of Army Group A in the Caucasus. However, Stavka also weighed the risk of overextension, particularly given the need to sustain the encirclement of the German 6th Army in Stalingrad and to guard against a potential counteroffensive from German forces regrouping west of the breakthrough. By the final week of December, the Soviet advances had captured or destroyed large quantities of Axis equipment, including over 600 artillery pieces and more than 200 tanks or assault guns, many abandoned due to mechanical breakdowns or fuel shortages. Prisoner counts varied by source, but Soviet reports claimed over 30,000 captured in the first week of the operation, with thousands more unaccounted for. The collapse of the Axis front on the Don was now a fact, and the operational question shifted from whether the Soviets could hold their gains to how far and how fast they could press their advantage before the enemy could reconstitute a defensive line. The peak of Operation Saturn unfolded in the last days of December 1942 and the first days of January 1943 as Soviet forces pressed deeper into the rear of the Axis coalition, transforming localized breakthroughs into a full operational collapse along a broad front. The offensive's momentum was carried by mechanized spearheads from the 1st and 3rd Guards armies, with the 24th and 25th Tank Corps leading advances of up to 40 kilometers in 48 hours, despite deteriorating weather and lengthening supply lines. These units targeted key transportation hubs such as Milarovo, Tatsinskaya, and Morozovsk, whose capture would sever remaining withdrawal routes and cripple the Axis logistical network. Tatsinskaya, home to a critical Luftwaffe airfield used to supply the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad, became the focus of one of the operation's most notable strikes. On 24th of December, the 24th Tank Corps under Major General Vasily Badanov penetrated over 150 kilometers into German rear areas, overrunning the airfield. Soviet tanks destroyed or captured more than 70 German transport aircraft on the ground, a blow from which the airlift effort to Stalingrad never recovered. While the 24th Tank Corps was eventually encircled and fought its way back with heavy losses, the raid demonstrated the vulnerability of Axis rear installations and contributed directly to the acceleration of German withdrawal orders. On the northern axis of the operation, the 3rd Guards Army pushed toward Kantemirovka and Lysky, threatening to outflank German positions along the upper Donets. Southward, the 6th Army advanced in coordination with cavalry mechanized groups that exploited gaps left by retreating Italian and Hungarian forces. The speed of these maneuvers forced the Germans to commit the 11th and 6th Panzer Divisions in piecemeal fashion, creating temporary blocking positions that delayed Soviet progress but could not reverse the strategic situation. For the Axis coalition, this period marked a critical decision point. On 28 December, the German High Command authorized Army Group A to begin withdrawing from the Caucasus toward Rostov-on-Don. The order reflected the recognition that the Soviet advance in the Don sector threatened to cut off the only viable retreat route. The movement of these forces, numbering over 300,000 men, required coordination under severe winter conditions and with Soviet cavalry and mechanized units harassing columns along secondary roads. In occupied areas, civilian populations were caught between retreating Axis troops and advancing Soviet forces. Requisitions, forced labor for road clearing, and reprisal actions occurred in both directions, particularly in villages suspected of aiding partisans. The destruction of infrastructure, bridges, rail lines, and depots by retreating Axis engineers further complicated the humanitarian situation, leaving thousands without shelter or adequate food in sub-zero temperatures. By early January 1943, the Soviet offensive had advanced the front line westward by as much as 250 kilometers in some sectors. While the pace of operations began to slow due to logistical strain and the need to consolidate gains, the peak of Operation Saturn had already reshaped the southern front. German forces in the Caucasus were now in full retreat. The Stalingrad pocket was irreversibly cut off, and the Axis strategic position in the southern Soviet Union had been permanently compromised. This set the stage for subsequent Soviet winter offensives aimed at exploiting the disarray of the retreating enemy and driving them beyond the Donbass and into Ukraine. In the aftermath of the peak thrusts of Operation Saturn, Soviet forces faced the challenge of sustaining offensive pressure while adapting to changing operational conditions. The destruction of the Italian 8th Army and the retreat of Axis units had created a vast operational gap, but exploitation required careful coordination between front commands. The Voronezh and southwestern fronts were tasked with continuing deep advances, while the Stalingrad front maintained the encirclement of the German 6th Army. One of the notable adaptations during this phase was the formation of mobile pursuit groups, combinations of tank corps, mechanized corps, and cavalry corps, intended to bypass residual Axis strongpoints and keep pressure on retreating columns. These units operated with lighter logistical tails, relying on captured Axis depots and local requisitioning to sustain rapid movement. This approach allowed formations like the 5th Guards Cavalry Corps to harass German and Hungarian rearguards along the approaches to the Donbass. The German High Command attempted localized counterattacks to buy time for the withdrawal of Army Group A from the Caucasus. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division, supported by assault gun brigades, launched spoiling attacks near Morozovsk in early January 1943. While these actions temporarily slowed Soviet tank brigades, they could not halt the overall advance. Soviet artillery density in these engagements often exceeded 100 guns and mortars per kilometer of front, overwhelming German defenses in a matter of hours. Partisan activity in the rear areas of the Axis further complicated the German retreat. Coordinated sabotage actions against rail lines, particularly in the Voroshilovgrad and Rostov regions, delayed the evacuation of heavy equipment and supplies. In several documented cases, German rearguards had to divert combat units to protect repair crews, reducing their ability to man prepared defensive lines. Despite these advantages, Soviet forces encountered increasing resistance as they approached the Donbass industrial region. The Germans prioritized defending key coal-producing areas and transportation nodes, redeploying battered but still functional divisions to hold urban strongpoints. The urban terrain and the onset of thaw conditions in late January, mud replacing frozen ground, slowed the tempo of operations. Morale among the Axis coalition varied. German divisions retained a higher level of cohesion than their allies, but sustained losses, logistical shortages, and the constant threat of encirclement eroded combat effectiveness. For Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian survivors, the retreat often meant abandonment of heavy weapons and reliance on German transport or their own foot marches to reach safety. Soviet interrogation reports from prisoners taken in January noted widespread confusion about the broader strategic situation, with many lower-ranking Axis soldiers unaware of the scale of the Soviet advances. By the third week of January 1943, the Soviets had advanced the front line to within striking distance of key Donbass cities. Although the pace slowed, the cumulative effect of continuous pursuit and harassment operations ensured that the Axis forces had no opportunity to stabilize their positions before the next phase of Soviet offensives. This period of adaptation and resistance set the stage for the eventual liberation of large parts of southern Soviet territory and further reduced the operational flexibility of the German command in the entire southern sector. By late January 1943, the operational dynamic of what had begun as Operation Saturn was shifting toward a decisive phase in which the Soviet command sought to translate battlefield momentum into strategic collapse for the Axis forces in southern Russia. The German retreat from the Caucasus was in full progress, and the success of the Soviet winter offensive had already forced Army Group A to abandon key positions it had fought to secure since the summer of 1942. The priority for Stavka was to prevent this withdrawal from becoming an orderly regrouping at the Mius or Dnieper lines. Soviet mobile groups advanced along converging axes toward Rostov-on-Don, the primary escape corridor for forces leaving the Caucasus. The Southwestern Front's 5th Tank Army and the 2nd Guards Army were reinforced with additional rifle divisions and artillery regiments to prepare for operations against German rearguards covering the retreat. Air units of the 8th Air Army intensified strikes against road and rail choke points, targeting bridges over the Don and Kalitva rivers to disrupt evacuation schedules. By mid-January, the German supply situation in the south had worsened, with fuel shortages forcing some motorized units to destroy or abandon vehicles they could not refuel. At the same time, the Soviet command faced its own logistical strains. Forward units operating in the steppe often outran their supply echelons. Ammunition stocks for artillery and tank units became a limiting factor in the tempo of operations, particularly in sectors where mobile groups had advanced 200 kilometers beyond their original start lines. Temporary pauses were ordered in some areas to allow the railways, converted from German to Soviet gauge, to catch up to the front and resume full logistical support. German defensive tactics during the withdrawal focused on forming strong points in towns and villages, garrisoned by mixed units including rear echelon personnel and ad hoc Kampfgruppen. These positions aimed to delay Soviet advances for 24-48 hours, enabling columns from Army Group A to pass through to safer positions. In certain cases, such as at Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, these strong points successfully delayed Soviet breakthroughs. but at the cost of leaving garrisons surrounded and destroyed when relief failed to arrive. Civilians in the contested zones were subjected to repeated population movements. German forces evacuated skilled laborers from the Donbass and Rostov industrial centers to the west, while Soviet authorities sought to re-establish local administrations in newly liberated areas. The destruction of infrastructure, deliberately by retreating German engineers and incidentally by combat, left much of the region without functioning rail services, power generation, or municipal water supply. By the end of January, the Soviet front had advanced to the approaches of Rostov-on-Don. Stavka anticipated that the fall of Rostov would sever the last direct overland route from the Caucasus to the western bank of the Don, trapping remnants of Axis formations that had not yet crossed. The Germans, aware of this danger, concentrated their strongest remaining formations, including elements of the 17th Army and 1st Panzer Army, to hold Rostov long enough to allow the bulk of their forces to escape. This convergence toward a single strategic point marked the beginning of the final and most decisive engagements of the operation. By the first week of February 1943, the final stage of the Soviet winter offensive along the Don centered on the decisive objective of Rostov-on-Don. The city was the last major gateway for Axis forces retreating from the Caucasus to the western bank of the Don. If taken, it would cut off the primary escape route for formations of Army Group A, potentially trapping tens of thousands of troops, along with heavy equipment and supply columns. The German command, under Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist, concentrated its most battle-worthy formations in the approaches to Rostov. Elements of the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army, supported by remnants of divisions withdrawn from the Kuban and North Caucasus, formed successive defensive belts east and south of the city. These lines combined field fortifications, anti-tank gun positions, and minefields, with urban strongpoints in nearby settlements such as Novocherkassk and Bataisk. Soviet forces advancing on Rostov comprised elements of the 2nd Guards Army, the 5th Tank Army, and the 28th Army, supported by air operations from the 8th Air Army. The Red Army Command's plan called for converging assaults from the northeast and east to encircle the city, while mobile groups attempted to intercept retreating Axis convoys west of the Don. Artillery preparation for the assault began in late January, focusing on disrupting German communications and supply movement within the city and its surrounding approaches. The battles in this sector were marked by intense close-quarters fighting. Soviet tank brigades attempting to push through the eastern suburbs encountered concentrated German anti-tank defenses, often with overlapping fields of fire from 75mm PaK-40 guns and captured Soviet 76.2mm field guns. In some cases, forward tank units advanced only a few hundred meters before being forced to withdraw under heavy fire. To overcome these defenses, Soviet infantry brigades and engineer sapper units were brought forward to clear mines, demolish barricades, and neutralize strong points. German rearguards, aware that their mission was to buy time rather than hold indefinitely, used delaying tactics such as sudden counterattacks against overextended Soviet spearheads, followed by rapid withdrawals to secondary positions. This approach allowed the bulk of retreating columns, many consisting of horse-drawn wagons, trucks, and tanks, to cross the Don bridges before they were threatened with capture. Luftwaffe transport aircraft and fighter bombers provided intermittent air cover, but fuel shortages and contested airspace limited their impact. On 14 February 1943, Soviet forces entered Rostov-on-Don from multiple directions. The German garrison, already reduced by stage withdrawals, resisted briefly in the city center before retreating across the frozen Don under covering fire. By the end of the day, Soviet units had secured most of the city, capturing significant stocks of abandoned materiel, including over 100 artillery pieces and hundreds of motor vehicles in varying states of repair. With Rostov taken, the Soviet winter offensive had achieved one of its most important operational goals. However, the German command succeeded in withdrawing the majority of Army Group A to the west, avoiding the mass encirclement that Stavka had hoped to achieve. Even so, The liberation of Rostov marked the collapse of the German southern flank and set the stage for Soviet advances into the Donbass and toward the Dnieper in the following months. The capture of Rostov-on-Don on 14th of February 1943 closed the immediate operational objectives of Operation Saturn, but the strategic implications continued to unfold over the following weeks. Soviet control of the city removed the last major Axis-controlled crossing over the lower Don and effectively severed direct overland communications between German forces retreating from the Caucasus and those still attempting to hold positions in the eastern Donbass. While the German command had avoided the catastrophic encirclement that Stavka had hoped for, the withdrawal had been costly in men, materiel, and strategic position. Post-battle assessments by the Soviet High Command credited the operation with destroying or rendering combat ineffective more than 20 Axis divisions, including the bulk of the Italian 8th Army, significant portions of the Hungarian 2nd Army, and several German infantry divisions. Conservative Soviet estimates placed Axis personnel losses from December 1942 to February 1943 at over 200,000, with 75,000 prisoners taken. Material losses included hundreds of tanks, thousands of motor vehicles, and large amounts of artillery, much of it abandoned during the retreat due to fuel shortages or transport bottlenecks. For the Soviet Union, the victory had multiple layers of significance. Militarily, it consolidated the gains of Operation Uranus by ensuring that the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad remained cut off, and it neutralized any realistic chance of an Axis relief effort from the south. Politically, it demonstrated to both domestic and Allied audiences that the Red Army could execute deep, multi-front operations over extended distances in winter conditions, challenging earlier German assumptions about Soviet operational limits. Economically, the liberation of parts of the North Caucasus and the approaches to the Donbass restored access to agricultural and industrial resources, though much of the infrastructure was heavily damaged. For the Axis, the consequences were severe. The German southern flank had been pushed back over 300 kilometers, placing Army Group South on the defensive for the remainder of the winter. The loss of Allied armies, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian, created gaps in Germany's coalition structure on the Eastern Front, forcing Berlin to commit more German divisions to hold the line, thus reducing strategic reserves. The morale impact on the Wehrmacht was compounded by the collapse of the Stalingrad pocket later in February, reinforcing the perception that the initiative had irreversibly shifted to the Soviet side. In the liberated regions, the Soviet administration faced immediate challenges: restoring basic services, clearing mines and unexploded ordnance, and re-establishing agricultural production in time for the spring planting season. NKVD units conducted security sweeps to identify collaborationist elements, while partisan units transitioned from sabotage roles to assisting in reconstruction and policing. The human cost of the campaign was stark, with thousands of civilians killed during combat or reprisals, and tens of thousands more displaced by the fighting. Operation Saturn's legacy was one of both achievement and missed opportunity. While the primary objectives of cutting off Army Group A completely were not fully realized, the campaign's success in destroying Axis allies and liberating vast territories marked it as a decisive contribution to the overall Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1942-43. Its operational lessons on the coordination of deep penetrations, the role of mobile groups, and the management of logistics in winter conditions would inform Soviet planning for the summer campaigns that followed, including the operations leading to the Battle of Kursk and the liberation of left bank Ukraine.